My name is Noelle Pierce, and I am 34 years old. 7 days before my sister's luxury wedding, she called to tell me I was no longer going to be her maid of honor. She didn't use the word removed. She called it a restructuring of the wedding party. She told me, in a voice so carefully practiced it sounded rehearsed, that her fiancé's family had traditions around the ceremony and that having a sister who worked as a paralegal didn't quite fit the aesthetic they were going for. I asked her what aesthetic she meant. She said, "You know, Noelle, the look, the whole thing." I did know. I'd known since the moment I first heard his last name, Winthrop. As in Winthrop Capital Group, the private equity firm with offices in 3 cities whose founder showed up in Forbes, the way other people showed up at the DMV. Reliably, without ceremony. My sister had met Calder at a charity fundraising gala 8 months earlier, and by the time I was hearing his name for the first time, the ring was already on her finger. I hadn't been invited to their engagement party. I hadn't been invited to the formal ring ceremony his family held at their estate in Connecticut. I had, however, been asked to stand in a bridesmaid dress that cost $780 and smile for photographs at a venue that charged $15,000 just for the Saturday rental. Until this week, apparently, when I had been quietly restructured out of the standing position and into a seat near the back. She said she'd send me the registry link so I could pick something meaningful, her voice lifting at the end, as if that were a gift being given, rather than a consolation handed out. The link arrived 20 minutes later, with a note that said, "So excited for you to be a part of the day." Attached to the note was a photo, their official engagement portrait, shot at what looked like a private estate outside the city. Rolling green lawn, late afternoon light, the kind of photograph that costs more than my monthly rent and is designed to look effortless. My sister looked radiant. She was laughing at something just off camera, tilted into her fiancé with the ease of someone who had finally, after a long time of holding her breath, let herself exhale. I looked at the man beside her for 4 seconds. Then I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and walked to the window. I stood there watching a woman in the parking lot load groceries into the back of a minivan. Normal things. Things that moved and made sense. Because what I had just seen in that photograph did not make sense, not in the way surprises don't, but in the way impossible things don't. The kind of thing you look at and think, "No, let me look again, let me make sure." I picked my phone back up and looked again. Same face, same jaw, same slight asymmetry in the left ear, the kind of small physical detail you notice once and never stop noticing, the kind of thing that lodges itself somewhere in the back of your memory and waits. The man in that photograph was not named Calder Winthrop. I knew his face because I had processed his paperwork. 2 years earlier, I'd been working as a junior paralegal at a title and escrow company outside Philadelphia. Quiet work, detail work, cross-referencing names on documents, flagging discrepancies before closings fell through. Most days were routine. But there was one closing I'd carried with me, the way you carry things that resolve badly without ever fully resolving. A buyer came in to close on a property in Chester County. Mid-sized home, clean deal on the surface, nothing unusual until I pulled his identification to verify against the deed, and found that the name on his driver's license didn't match the name on 2 of the supporting documents his attorney had submitted. I flagged it to my supervisor. My supervisor made a call. The closing was delayed. The buyer left the office quickly. The deal never went through. Afterward, my supervisor told me in the way people tell you things without quite telling you that the buyer had some complications. I never learned the full story, but I remembered his face clearly because he had looked directly at me when I pointed out the discrepancy. A flat, measuring look, the kind that takes stock of exactly how much of a problem you are about to be for him. That face was in my sister's engagement photo. I thought about calling her immediately. I almost did. But I stopped because I knew exactly how that conversation would unfold 7 days before her wedding. She'd ask how I knew. I'd have to explain a flag title closing, a face I'd held onto for 2 years, a deal that didn't go through. She'd say that wasn't proof. She'd say I was jealous. She'd say I was doing this because I'd been taken out of the wedding party. In her position, I might have said the same things. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I said a word to anyone in this family. I called my former supervisor that night. He had been in the industry long enough to remember the closing and quiet enough about what he knew to be trusted. When I explained what I thought I was looking at, he was silent for a moment before he said he'd see what he could pull from the records and call me back. He called back in 4 hours. The buyer who had walked out of our closing was named Ryan Steck. The discrepancy I'd flagged had come from documents submitted under a variation of his name, tied to an LLC that had since been dissolved. My supervisor had pieced together more over the years through an industry contact. Ryan Steck had a wife, a legal, courthouse-married wife in the state of Georgia. He had never filed for divorce. He had simply stopped appearing in that life and built a new one somewhere else. The name Calder Winthrop, my supervisor believed, had no legitimate paper trail behind it. Nothing older than 3 or 4 years. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. If my sister walked down the aisle and married Calder Winthrop, she wouldn't be legally married at all. The ceremony would be a nullity, because the man at the altar was already married to someone else. The entire thing, the $15,000 venue, the Connecticut estate, the Winthrop name, the Forbes list father, had been built on documents that belonged to a man who did not exist. Worse than that, she would be binding her life to someone who had already shown, with full clarity, that he was capable of carrying multiple identities, of walking away from legal commitments, of looking a 27-year-old paralegal in the face when he was caught, and simply finding somewhere else to go. I made my decision that night. I did not call my sister. I did not call my mother, who would have come apart, and then made 7 rapid decisions in a row, each one making everything more complicated. I called the district attorney's office the next morning. The intake coordinator transferred me to a detective who handled fraud and identity cases. He was steady, unhurried, the way people are when they've heard versions of this before. I gave him Ryan Steck's name, the original closing date, my supervisor's contact information, and the name Calder Winthrop as the alias currently in use. I told him there was a wedding in 6 days and that I believed there was an existing marriage in Georgia that had never been legally dissolved. He said he would look into it. He said I should not contact the groom or my sister directly. I didn't. The 5 days that followed were among the quieter and more difficult days I have had. I went to work. I answered emails. I ate dinner at my kitchen counter most nights, watching cooking videos on my phone, because the silence in my apartment had a weight to it I couldn't fill with anything that felt proportionate. I had done what I could do, and handed it to people with the actual authority to act on it, and now there was nothing left for me to control. Every morning I woke up wondering whether Ryan Steck would sense what was coming and disappear before anyone could reach him. On the morning of the wedding, I did not go to the venue. The detective had called the previous evening to say that through Georgia's Vital Records office, they had confirmed the existing marriage and coordinated with local law enforcement. He didn't give me details about the plan. He said he would follow up afterward. I stayed home. I made coffee. I sat at my window and watched the parking lot I'd been watching all week, and thought about my sister in her wedding dress, and about the moment when everything was going to become clear to her, and about the fact that there was nothing I could do now to soften that moment, or move it, or make it arrive differently than it was going to arrive. My mother called at 11:47 in the morning. She was crying hard enough that I could only catch pieces of what she was saying. I heard police. I heard not real. I heard he had another wife. Then she said my sister's name like a question, the way you say someone's name when you aren't sure they're still standing upright. I got in my car and drove to the venue. By the time I arrived, it was over in the procedural sense. The ceremony had been stopped before my sister had even reached the altar, because law enforcement had made the decision to intercept Ryan Steck during the processional, rather than at the altar itself. He had been escorted out through a side entrance while 180 guests sat in their chairs without understanding what was happening. My sister had been brought to a private room with my mother and 2 of her closest friends. I found them there. My sister was still in her dress. She hadn't eaten since the night before. She looked the way people look when something large and expected is suddenly missing from the space where it was supposed to be. Not theatrical grief, not dramatic collapse, just a quiet absence of light, the kind that goes very deep. She looked up when I walked in and said, "How long did you know?" I told her the truth, 6 days. She nodded slowly and didn't say anything else for a while. My mother poured me a glass of water from a pitcher on the side table and set it in front of me without speaking, solving the smallest possible problem, because all the large ones were beyond solving right then. What came later was what always comes later in these situations. The paperwork, the investigation, the slowly assembling picture of how long something has been happening, and how carefully it was constructed. Ryan Steck had been living under the Calder-Winthrop identity for approximately 3 years. The Winthrop Capital Group had been fabricated through a series of Shell LLC registrations and a cloned website that had been professionally built and actively maintained. He had identified my sister through the fundraising circuit as someone with sufficient social ambition and enough distance from due diligence to be a workable next chapter. His wife in Georgia, when contacted, had not known where he was. She had been trying to find him for 2 years in connection with a separate civil fraud matter that had stalled. My mother never apologized for the restructuring conversation. I didn't expect her to. That is not how she operates, and after 34 years, I have learned not to wait for things to arrive in forms they are not going to arrive in. But about 6 weeks after the wedding, that wasn't. She called and asked if I would come for dinner. No occasion, no explanation. Just dinner on a Tuesday. I went. My sister and I have rebuilt something. It's slower and more deliberate than what came before, which was always more parallel than genuinely close. She asked me once, over coffee neither of us finished, whether I had ever thought about simply telling her directly when I found out. I told her I had thought about almost nothing else for 6 days. She said she understood why I hadn't. She said she probably wouldn't have believed me. She was right. I knew she was right even when I made the decision, and it was one of the lonelier things I've had to carry. Knowing a truth that you cannot hand directly to someone without watching it detonate in their hands. Knowing that the most direct path is not always the one that actually arrives somewhere useful. So you take the longer road, and you hand the truth to the people who are equipped to do something responsible with it. And you sit at your kitchen window and wait. A woman in Georgia knows where her husband has been. My sister is sleeping in her own apartment with her own name, which was the only name that ever actually belonged to her. The family that quietly moved me from the front of the room to the back of the room, that decided I didn't fit the aesthetic they were building, that sent me a registry link as a parting gift. That family called me at 11:47 in the morning when everything came down. I think about that sometimes when I'm at my kitchen counter with my coffee going warm. Not with the kind of satisfaction that wants to be named. Something quieter than that. The feeling that comes from knowing that being overlooked and being invisible are not the same thing. People who cannot see you clearly cannot predict what you're capable of. They don't know what you remember, or what you notice, or what you're willing to do when the moment asks something of you. That is not always a disadvantage. Sometimes it is exactly the thing that stops a disaster 5 days, or 6 days, before it becomes permanent.